Hi everyone, welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show. I am your host, Mark Philpott. Oh yeah, Scotland. That's what we're going to be talking about today, the beautiful country of Scotland. And I can tell you, you're going to learn a lot about this country that you didn't know. So if you haven't been there yet and it's on your bucket list, make sure you listen in closely because there's a lot of great things to learn from my guest today. Her name is Janice Hopper-Sheehan, and she's going to be telling us all about Scotland. So Janice, welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show.
Hello, good morning.
How are you today?
I'm good. I've sussed out all the technology to actually talk to you, and it's great to talk to someone on the other side of the world, so a good start.
Well, it is, and even though we had a little minor hiccup to get connected today, it's still fascinating, isn't it, that I can be sitting here on my sailboat in the waters of Queensland, Australia, and you're up there. And are you in the Scottish Highlands? Or
Aberdeen, so Grampian region.
Aberdeen, right. Well, even so, it's fantastic, isn't it, that we can have this conversation today. Mm-hmm. So what I do with all of my guests, I give you the opportunity to actually dedicate your episode to someone special in your life. So who would you like to dedicate your show to today?
Well, it's had to just be my immediate family, my husband and two little boys who come travelling with me all the time around Scotland, and have probably seen more islands and ferries and hillsides than your average little toots. So it's been great to have them join me travelling around Scotland.
Your average little toot, did you call them?
Little toots, yeah.
Okay, so
that's what I say on a good day with them.
So this is a podcast, but I'll do my best to put captions in for my audience around the world who don't understand some of the Scottish slang. But we'll take that on board because that's going to be part of the fun of the show today, I'm sure. Now let's put some names behind the faces. So what's your husband's name?
Eamon.
Eamon, okay, and the two kids?
Samuel and Joseph.
Samuel and Joseph. Okay, well that's a lovely dedication to your family, and you'll be able to all sit down together and have a listen to the show.
Mm-hmm.
That'll
last about
time,
2 minutes with their patience, their attention span.
Now, have you ever been on a podcast show before?
No, first time.
No, first time. Oh, wow. Are you a podcast listener? Do you listen to podcasts?
Not so much, not because of anything to do with podcasts, but I've just been exceptionally busy for the last 6 years. It's like everything just went on hold with the children. Like I didn't go to the cinema so much, I didn't read books so much, everything stopped. So I think it's something I'll be getting into a lot more as they get a little bit older.
Okay, Scotland the Brave. We've got plenty to talk about with Scotland and everything today, but I thought before we got onto that, we'd have a little bit more of a chat and understand a bit more about you and your connection to the travel world. When did you first go on your first big travel experience as a young person?
Oh, as a young person, we did tend to stay in Scotland a lot. And because my parents were actually English and Irish, they took time to tour Scotland because it was almost like a new country to them. And we were taken to places a lot of kids weren't necessarily taken to because they'd all want to go to like Tenerife or, somewhere with a bit of sun. So I remember like traipsing across Culloden Moor and finding that more interesting than your average child, and I think that's because so much blood was shed on that field, and it was one of those horrible histories where it just piques your interest. And again, we went to Killiecrankie. There's a bit called Soldier's Leap where I think a red coat leapt a huge, quite a huge ravine for a human to jump in an attempt to get away from his enemy who had, quite bloodthirsty intentions. And just things like that I remember seeing or hearing about in Scotland and finding the history quite colourful, even as a child. And anything to do with Mary Queen of Scots, I found really interesting, like her life and all the people she came across and her different husbands. So I think that got an interest for me into history. And they weren't big trips. I mean, sometimes I was bored. I'm not going to pretend, your typical kid kind of, are we there yet? But I think we explored Scotland in a different way because my parents were, I guess, kind of blow-ins, is the phrase they sometimes use, where you're not a local. So we did dedicate some time to understanding the country a bit more from I've been here since I'm 2, so I am definitely local, but my parents wanted to dedicate that time.
So you were actually born where?
Dubai.
You were born in
It's the
Dubai.
oil links, Dubai, Aberdeen. Yeah, and I've got lots of friends in Houston. So yeah.
Okay, there you go. So there's a good story behind that as well. So your father was working in Dubai at the time? Yeah, fantastic. And how long were they in Dubai for?
He was working in Abu Dhabi, but they take the mothers to Dubai to give birth. I think the hospitals were considered better. So yeah.
So how long was the family down there for?
I think I don't know how long they were there. I mean, it must have been, just around 5 to 7 years. And then we moved to Scotland when I was 2.
Have you been back to that area since then, around Dubai and Abu Dhabi?
I went to Dubai for a holiday, for a birthday, just to kind of actually see where I was born, that kind of, I guess, narcissistic interest in your own origins, and went to the hospital. Just to stand outside it, because a lot of people are kind of born down the road. They drive past the hospital they're born in all the time. Like my kids are born in Aberdeen. We could walk there in like probably under 10 minutes. So for me, it was just quite interesting to go and see a little bit more of that.
So when you went on these trips around Scotland with your parents, did they were they kind of weekend trips? Were they school holiday trips as well? Was there a variety of different timings?
No, it'd be more school holiday trips, so quite significant, like a week or 2 weeks. That's what I mean. They were quite full on, just touring around. I don't remember everything, but I remember Loch Ness and looking for the monster there, looking for Nessie. And I have taken my children back, and there's some fantastic little cruises you can do which have sonar, so you can take the hunting for Nessie really quite seriously.
Yeah.
And it just keeps them really occupied. And what's a lovely little kind of boat trip, essentially, in a very picturesque location, but you throw in a little monster, and they got a little kit from the cruise company. All children get a pack, and so they're colouring pictures and just a little bit more entertained than your average lochside exploration.
I've got the whole question about the Loch Ness monster further on in my list of questions, but you've already brought it up, so we might as well talk about it. So what's your take on it all? Do you believe there is a Loch Ness monster?
It's the Loch is so vast and so deep. I think that's where the thinking comes that anything could be in it, because it's actually, I don't have the merit, but it's so deep that you could, a monster could feasibly live there. But what's interesting is there is a museum on the kind of banks of the Loch that, taking the myth of the monster aside, you can cover the history of the Loch, like how it was formed, but also take the search for Nessie in quite a historical sense, as in who searched, what did they use, what machines were used, and some people have went and kind of almost camped out by the Loch to have any sighting, so they're there every day first thing. So that centre is quite interesting because it charts what some people would see as a load of nonsense, other people would believe in wholeheartedly, but it takes it quite objectively. So whether you believe in the monster or not, you can cover the history of the hunt for Nessie or the search for Nessie. And then there was a castle, there's a wonderful castle, a ruined castle on the Loch side, Urquhart Castle, and that's now owned by the National Trust for Scotland, and you can explore the castle. And we told the kids that maybe if we climbed to the top of the tower, we might see Nessie. So you've never seen kids scramble to the top of the tower faster. So it was a great way to kind of engage the children on what would normally be, a loch with a castle, and it's engaging people in a different way. I think you factor in the Nessie element, and it just has such a big appeal.
So if we were to do a poll of all the Scottish people and we asked them if they believed in Nessie or not, what would the percentages be for and against, do you think?
I think knowing the Scottish people, what was it, Boaty McBoatface was what they tried to name a boat when they're asked to give it a name. I think they'd probably vote wholeheartedly for her existence, whether they believed it or not.
And I guess it'd be important to factor in what time of the day they were asked as well.
Yeah, or whether it's a Saturday night, that kind of thing.
Now, okay, let's keep on talking about travel in relation to yourself. So you did your first overseas trip, obviously, when you were very young, but when was the next meaningful overseas trip for you that you can remember?
I think the biggest trip for me was backpacking. Took a 6 month career break, so I was a little bit older, and I realised that if I didn't kind of do it now, I probably wouldn't do it. I went to my employer. I was a TV director at the time, and I got 6 months off to go around the world, and I took in quite a lot of countries: Germany, Switzerland, Italy for 2 months, Australia, Singapore, New York, so not wider America, but New York for 10 days, Christmas shopping at the very end of the trip, and Australia for 2 months. So that's
Fantastic.
when I dropped by Brisbane briefly.
So when you did a trip like that, what was the determination around the places that you were going to visit? How did you actually decide where you were going to go?
Well, it started off where a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, he was going to come with me, and we went through Switzerland and Germany, and he planned most of it. I'd spent my life planning other people's schedules, very complex film schedules, often international, over like 10 days. So I was used to organising for a massive team. Well, I felt massive. It was probably only 6 of us going around the world. And I was just fed up with being organised, if you get my meaning. So I booked to go to Italy after the Germany Switzerland, which was about 3 weeks, and I didn't have a return ticket. So if I spent the rest of the 6 months in Italy, it was just, if you're happy, just follow your nose kind of thing. But then it was often determined by people I actually met. So I was glad I hadn't scheduled everything and booked every single ticket. So I think wherever people are going, if you've got some freedom, now always allow a little bit of freedom in your schedule. Because I met these lovely Swedish girls in Rimini in Italy. So one of my next destinations was Sweden, and they were in Gothenburg. And then I booked tickets to see, I ended up going to Australia, partly because I knew a girl in Melbourne. So I booked tickets knowing that I could kind of drop by her house and see her. So I like that flexibility. And then another friend moved to Singapore. So on the way to Australia, I went and stayed with a girl from Scotland and her parents. So I think it's always nice to leave some flexibility in the schedule, even in just a 2 week holiday, so that if something piques your interest when you are somewhere, you might have that opportunity to pursue it.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think in terms of many people get stuck into the schedule that they've set themselves and maybe restrict themselves to looking outside the box when it comes to those opportunities coming along, because one of the most incredible things we all know about travel is the people you run into when you're traveling, and how they can connect with your life and vice versa. And if you're willing to step outside the comfort zone and let those doors open, you just don't know where it might end up.
Well, I think there's also, I mean, talking about Scotland as well, there is a perception that there's key places to visit in Scotland. Now, I totally get that. When I went to New York, I wanted to see the Empire State Building. I wanted to see the Statue of Liberty. So there is a bit of a tick box when people come to Scotland. A bit of a very popular route, like fly into Edinburgh, go up to Loch Ness, then head over to Skye, then go back to Edinburgh. And it's like there's so much more to Scotland. I mean, those places I totally rate, just like I rate the Statue of Liberty in New York. But there's so much more for people to see if they choose a different route, or if when they're there they hear about somewhere else that they can possibly investigate if they so wish.
That's a really fascinating point. Do you think that the advent of something like Airbnb has changed the way that people set their itineraries by actually staying in locals' places and talking to locals more and getting, I guess, a bit of a deeper understanding on the local areas? Do you think that's actually helped to change people's itineraries in some respects?
Well, when I've stayed in Airbnbs, I haven't really necessarily talked to lots of people. Like been talking to the neighbours as such. It has been more of a base, and I think it's more when people are making their plans, let's say over in Australia or in America to visit Scotland. I think they've got quite a set tick list, and it's to maybe move away from that sometimes, and just see what other sites you might be able to see before you head off. Because if you've booked all your Airbnbs in like the top 5 popular places, then that's where you're going to go. So you're not going to veer off the beaten track that much.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So that trip you did around the world, you were telling us that did your friend who did the European portion with you, did he drop out, did he? And you ended up doing the
Well,
rest
he
by
had to go
yourself?
back to work.
Ah, okay.
So it was always meant to be a holiday on his part. And he was working in Germany, which is why we kind of did Switzerland up to Germany. So it was a chap I went to school with. And then he did meet me again, and we got the night train. He said, "Oh, I've booked tickets. We're going to get the train to Sicily." And I was like, "Oh, don't be so silly. That's an island." But you can actually get a night train, and it drives onto a ferry. Who knew? Who knew? So, and some other people did come and join me as well. Like another girl from Scotland flew over, and we did the Amalfi Coast together. So it was quite nice. Other people could have holidays with me if it suited them. They had the cash, they had the time. So it wasn't a case of people kind of peeling off. It was just nice to have a familiar face pop up alongside all the friendly people you meet in hostels.
It was a bit like a relay team by the sound of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I say, it's just nice to see someone who knows you, who's known you for a very long time, alongside all that's new and wondrous and fabulous when you're traveling.
What did you learn about yourself after those 6 months of traveling around the world?
I think you realise that there is a whole world out there. It sounds so obvious, but people are so stuck in the kind of day to day that you can pack so much into a week on holiday or traveling compared to a week at home where you've got work, the gym, maybe a class or something. The week can just fly by in quite a blur at home, whereas I think it's so punctuated when you're abroad. And I did kind of learn that I didn't necessarily need a a job in the sense of an emotional sense, but I obviously need an income. But you could there's a whole world that might employ you. So I think people can get very stuck with one employer in one vicinity and think that their whole world is going to collapse if they're not working that for that person. And I do obviously feel that financially that you need money, but emotionally I think I shed a lot of ties that I didn't actually need to have. So that was quite liberating in a way.
How old were you when you did that trip?
31. I think it was
Okay.
31, 32. So quite old for a backpacker, yeah,
Mm.
when you look at the
So,
average.
so in terms of your own personal evolution, what did you end up as far as your trajectory went when you got back from that trip? Did you go, well, this is fantastic, I want to keep traveling, or did some other switch go on for you?
Well, I did go back to work because I'm quite a loyal person in many senses because they'd given me the break and I wanted to go back and get back to normal and an element of routine. But I think there's no doubt that inspired me to kind of do what I do now. So when I had the children and I wanted to spend more time with them, it was quite a natural step to take the writing skills that I had from writing script after script after script for television shows and write features. And I decided I wanted to do travel. So now I kind of write as a freelance writer based up in Scotland for a range of UK national and Scottish national publications, be it magazines or newspapers. But I always thought that sounded such a great job and you'd be very glamorous flying all over the world. But what I've discovered is a lot of time the quality publications, they want you to write about what you know, and what you know isn't necessarily like a small Greek island, it's what's on your doorstep. So I do get a lot of commissions for example, Royal Deeside in Scotland, which is where the Queen has Balmoral Castle, and all the distilleries, the Queen Victoria heritage there. So that's always been a popular selling point for myself, or down in Stonehaven with Dunnottar Castle. So and I do go on foreign press trips, but obviously it's hard for me with the childcare element as well. So it's just been a great career to combine my my passions with my family, and the blog I run, Scots to Travel, it has got a family element, so I take the children with me, and the whole point is not only am I reviewing accommodation or attractions across Scotland or regions of Scotland to see what's on offer, how good they are, what makes them stand out, but also add in the family element to see what the appeal is for children. And naturally, some hotels and some regions stand out a little bit more than others.
For everyone listening today, Janice's blog is called scots2travel.com. That's two as in the number two, true. And I'll be putting that in the show notes today so everybody can check out your work there, Janice. What actually inspired you to start the travel blogging?
I think I had two children quite close together, and I suddenly was terrified of going anywhere. For someone who filmed in Beijing and Moscow, for someone who went backpacking on my own as a solo traveller without a kind of thought about it, I suddenly had this tiny bundle and I was scared to go as far as Dundee. The anxiety was quite high when you're taking these screaming, beautiful little objects with you. So when I searched online for places that would welcome me, because I suddenly felt as though I was taking a barking dog everywhere I went. It was I couldn't go to these nice restaurants anymore, I felt. And I just had this anxiety about where I could go. But everything I searched was, quite London-based, or the south of England, as in, the Cornwall's beautiful, Devon's, and I'm sure it is, or the Lake District, but I'm not going to drive there from Aberdeen. That I needed somewhere a lot closer, and I couldn't find anywhere suggesting great places in Scotland where you could go. So I thought, well, rather than complain, just do something about it. And it also gave me something to do. So it was one of these very organic, natural processes where you start doing something to kind of partly fill my time because I was on my second maternity leave, but also because I just couldn't see it. And I thought, if it's not there, I'll make it happen.
When you were travelling around the world as a 30-year-old and you were opening your mouth and out came that beautiful Scottish accent, what did people ask you the most about in relation to Scotland?
There wasn't a great deal. I mean, I think they all do kind of hook on the kind of bagpipes, Highland cows, Nessie. I think people do have quite an image of Scotland, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, when we talk about Italy, we talk about pasta and pizza, and obviously and art and architecture and romance. There's a lot more to it than that. So I think what travels are the national stereotypes, but they're usually the positive ones. I mean, but I don't remember any really deep questions about Scotland. People, in a way, they were just interested to see what was in front of them, living in the moment and out to have a good time.
Yeah, that's funny because whenever I come across a Scots person when I'm travelling around the world, the first thing I will talk to them about is Billy Connolly. Because to me, he is the symbol of Scotland. He's somebody that I grew up with in my head. I've watched every single show that I think he's produced, and I adore the man, and I think he's probably, in my own little world, he to me is what Scotland is all about. He's funny, he's eccentric, he's a great ambassador for your country.
His style of comedy does kind of tap into, how egalitarian Scotland is, and he started out on in the shipworks, on the west coast, and so he's come from quite, what's known as quite a tough background. Hard-working background, and he's risen to kind of international star, but his humour is still so grounded, and he says it as it is, and he makes swearing an art form. And I mean, I can't imagine, I've never met someone who says they don't find him funny, and I think if you did, you'd be a bit worried about that person. He's he is fantastic, and he touches on things that or just, even just things like when you're visiting Scotland, he says, get a raincoat, just live a little. Don't worry, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothes. So, and he's so right in that respect, as in, stop moaning, just sort yourself out,
What does the average Scottish person think of Billy Connolly? Is he adored in your
Oh, I
country?
think I think they do adore him. I mean, because he just speaks, he hasn't really lost touch with how people think or speak. And he, as I say, he just touches on things we can all relate to. But I think what's interesting about Scotland as well is people, because the early Scots travel so much, be it through business and enterprise or part of the empire, which some of it obviously wasn't a chapter that anyone in the UK should be proud of, but and then you tap into also the clearances, which was another desperately unfortunate episode in history. There's so many people descended from Scots that you'll have folk all over Australia and America with this real connection to Scotland that is true because, let's say, their great-great-great-grandfather arrived on a boat either as perhaps someone from the clearances or as part of the East India Company or as a convict or whatever path they came to. It is a real connection, yet in some ways it's not real because they've never been to Scotland, but they have a very clear image of and pride in their roots, which is admirable. And I went to a small place in Pictou in Canada because that was, I think, one of the first places settled in Canada when a ship of emigrants left Greenock on the west coast and sailed. I mean, you can't imagine embarking on a journey like that now.
No.
It's just unfeasible, and people would pass away on the journey, so they must have been desperate to take these steps. But now they still have, like, there's a statue of a man in Scottish regalia, pride of place in town. They have an annual festival. There's a boat. There was a kind of, they've recreated the boat that landed, and I was obviously blown away because it was like little mini Scotland, and they, on the day of the festival, they reenact the landing, or it was just this connection to where this town had come from was full on Scotland. Bagpipers play, and you fly for hours and you arrive somewhere and they're obviously looking back to Scotland and celebrating where they came from, even if they've never set foot in Scotland themselves, obviously. But it's just a very important part of their own personal history.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And when you think about the sense of, I can hear it in your voice when you think about the sense of pride that you hear a Scottish accent somewhere on the other side of the world, or you see the roots and history of your country being spread, and it grows like tentacles. And it's, I'm a very proud New Zealander, and wherever I go in the world and I hear a Kiwi accent, I immediately, my ears prick up and I dive into that story on why are you here, how did you get here, what presents do you have here. But you're coming from Scotland, you have such a deeper history with the way that your culture has spread around the world, because as you say, you've only got to go somewhere and you hear the bagpipes playing and immediately you think of Scotland. And
well, even in New York,
you
can hear them often enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that, they're not just ubiquitous to Scotland. I mean, obviously people can play them wherever they choose, but it's just funny how far reaching some of the culture has gone.
Yeah, indeed. Now back to your blog. How long have you been doing it for?
Oh my goodness, it must be about 4 years now, but it's been very much, I say, when I started it, I had a newborn baby and a 16-month-old, so it really wasn't like at the forefront of my mind. It was something that I felt passionate about, and it has built over that time. And I think often when you start something because you believe in it, people follow it and read it because you are being quite authentic and telling things as they are. And it's just been great to reveal places across Scotland that aren't necessarily the most predictable, because you're often approached by people who, they aren't necessarily getting the kind of expected footfall of somewhere like Edinburgh. It's quirkier locations, a bit more interesting, or new launches. So it's been really good to share that with people. And I always say that, you know, with my blog, there is a family angle, but if you can do what I'm suggesting with children, like visit these places with children, then you can certainly visit it without them and just have a slightly more relaxed time. Because we go all over the place. And because I'm based in Aberdeen, I mean, for us, it's almost as quick for us to go to Orkney or Shetland as London. And they're these islands that seem so remote and really bring up what so much of Scottish history and what people seek when they visit Scotland are actually really easy to reach. You literally fall asleep on a boat and you know, to go to Shetland, and you wake up there the next morning. It's actually so joined up. But then you do feel you're in quite a remote, but very, very, very civilized island. And it's not just one island, it's like an archipelago. So you can island hop within the islands as well. So those are some of my favorite destinations where you're kind of going somewhere that isn't, you know, on the top 10 or top 5 list of Scotland for your overseas visitors.
What was the aim of your blog when you first started it?
Well, it was to kind of show what you could do with a departure point of Scotland or Aberdeen, as in you do not have to travel far to have a good experience with your family. As I said, you know, suggesting Cornwall or Devon to me was no use. I want to show the finest activities for a range of pockets, a range of outlooks, but from a perspective where it all felt quite achievable and encouraging, because travel isn't always easy. You know, it can be stressful. And I think a lot of the time when you read features in magazines or newspapers, I write them as well, so I am fully aware you don't really go into the nitty-gritty of the, you know, what you might need, like top tips for visiting this area. And I think that's where blogs step in, because they really go into like, oh, remember to bring small change if for this, or remember the parking's a nightmare here, we recommend here. And that's where blogs go into a lot more detail about if you actually want to visit somewhere, this is what you need to know to get the best out of your time, the best out of your money, the best out of your day. And I think that's why they're doing so well, because it's the level of detail and passion that go into each one.
Yeah, very good point. Where do you see your blog in 5 years from now?
I'll have more time to dedicate to it. I just want it to get bigger and better, but remain relevant and cover more of Scotland that doesn't get necessarily a light shone on it the way that it often should, because there's so many adventures to be had. And obviously as the children get bigger, I can do a lot more activities. So we do things like camping and glamping. But now that they can both, for example, ride bikes, we can go off and do a lot more active things. Maybe we've started doing slightly bigger hikes now. So over winter, we kind of covered some family walks or hillsides that are quite achievable if you've got reasonable mobility. So no, we're not tackling, you know, like Ben Nevis, but, you know, who knows, we'll, in a few years, who knows where we'll be.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. For someone listening today who's considering starting their own travel blog, what are a couple of tips that you would send out to them before they get going?
I'd say look at what exactly you're offering in terms of why it might be different from the other 50 that are out there. So have a look at what other people are doing, because you have to feel passionately about the topic you're covering, be it like food and travel or more wild travel, or you know, travel with a disability, travel with dogs. I mean, I think niche is quite important. So just to think what you might be offering that nobody else is offering will obviously give you a bit of a head start, rather than just duplicating what someone else is doing. But I think you have to genuinely, obviously, enjoy travel, and I think travel bloggers at the minute have a reputation for, not with everyone, a lot of people do appreciate what we do, the free content that's just on the internet, but they think that we just get things for free. And I just wonder why on earth anyone thinks anyone gets anything for free in this world. Nothing is free. If you hear something's free, you're always told it's a scam. So, we do not get things for free. The amount of work that goes into things for a reason is, it is a lot of work, and you do it because you believe in it. And then there is the financial side, as in once things start monetizing. But I mean, my husband gets put in hotels for work. I used to get put in hotels for work all the time because I had to be somewhere. And no one ever said to me then, oh my God, you get to stay in hotels for free. It's like, well, yeah, I've got to go to the office in London in the morning. Where else am I going to stay? Whereas as a blogger, if you go and stay somewhere, it's like, people have a funny view of it. So how else am I meant to write about this place? And when I write about it as a travel writer as well, press trips, of course, if you ended up paying for every hotel, you just wouldn't be able to go at all. The job would not get done. Just like if my husband or I myself had to pay for all our hotels, it would wipe out our salary when we had a normal kind of office job, if you see what I mean. So it's just there's a funny dichotomy there.
I'm glad you brought it up. I think it's a great analogy to use what you just said about the, traveling for business, and traveling for your travel blog is your business. And I see in the world today, we've got all these younger ones who are jumping on YouTube, and these influencers on Instagram, and even in the podcast world, we're starting to see it now, where people think they have this rite of passage to free things and all the rest of it, but it quickly becomes very...
it'll become apparent to them.
It becomes very apparent to them very, very quickly. Okay, let's dive...
But it's also sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to also say, I think there's also a slight power struggle with the fact that anyone can set up a blog. So all the gateways to having a voice and having the right to communicate, which were kind of controlled by having a job or a commission at a newspaper or a magazine or on a television channel, those gateways have been removed. So all people now have a right to communicate, and obviously the public have to suss through what's good and what's nonsense, has got bad grammar, or is just really gushing over the places or food they're trying to review. But on the positive side, if you take away all the gateways, which are kind of held usually by not a certain type of person, but this is now open to anyone. So any minority can set up a blog, any gender, any race, any colour, and there's no barriers to going on your laptop and setting one up. So that's a two-edged sword, because on one hand there's no quality control, but on the other hand I can see why the blogs are a bit of a threat to mainstream publications. Yeah, I mean, that's it. The audience will sort the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite quickly.
Listen, thanks very much for taking the time out in this episode to talk about your journey within the travel blogging world, because I have a lot of listeners that are really interested in that. But now I want to flick the switch, and I want to get really deep into talking about Scotland and all of the wonderful places to go. So one of the things that I love to do when I have travel bloggers on my show is to give you a couple of questions where I try to catch you out. So want to know how well you know your country. So here we go. I've got a couple of doozies lined up for you.
Oh no.
How many miles is the border between Scotland and England?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Oh, I have absolutely no idea.
There you go. It's a useless piece of information, and now you're never going to...
How long is it?
You're never going to forget it now after I tell you. It's 108 miles along the border between Scotland and England, through the Cheviot Hills and the River Tweed. And in fact, it's 174 kilometres for people who actually decide things in kilometres. So there you go.
I do cheer when I drive across it. It doesn't matter in which direction. It's obviously nice to go home, but when we're leaving, we're always going somewhere exciting. So it's like, for the children in the car, like, look, we're leaving Scotland. Oh my goodness, we're in England. Oh my goodness. And it is quite exciting. But no, the fact it's 108 miles is neither here nor there to me.
Exactly right. And nor's the next one, but I just thought I'd throw it at you as well.
Oh, okay.
So you talked earlier about the historical significance of Scotland, and I'm going to stick to the border region again here, because there's a town on the border that between the years of 1147 and 1482, it changed hands between the English and the Scottish no less than 13 times. Do you know what town that is?
I don't, but I imagine it'd be something like Jedburgh, Melrose, or Hawick, one of those kind of border towns, but I don't know which one.
It's Berwick-on-Tweed.
Berwick-on-Tweed.
Yeah.
Berwick-on-Tweed, okay.
So it was a very confused town for a long, long time in the history of Scotland and England. There you go. I'm sure you'll get the last one I've got here, and it is, how many islands are there in total in Scotland?
Oh, I don't know, because there's also the amount of inhabited ones and uninhabited ones. I did actually tally up how many I'd visited, and it's a lot. I have actually done a lot of them, including really quite remote ones like Muck, that has a population of about 30. And I actually got stranded there during a storm. So my trip to like this very small island was way longer than expected, but we had a ball. But I don't know the number. But I mean, even like if you look at Shetland or Orkney, there's so many little islands off of them. It'll be way more, I think, than people would expect.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I was researching this, I saw this number. I thought, no way. It's not possible that Scotland has this many
No, it'll be
islands.
a lot.
But,
yeah.
So the number is actually 790.
Oh my goodness, that does surprise me. I mean, you've got
790, yeah.
On the west coast, there's like Egg, Rum, Canna, and the Egg is community owned. Rum, I think Rum's the one where it's only people who work in wildlife tend to go there. You know, it's quite seasonal. And then you've got St Kilda that's abandoned, but people do go there for work purposes. But it's not like your usual community which you get on, you know, like a small island like Cumbria. And there are some wonderful little islands. I see, for people who don't want to commit to an island as such, you can, or you know, if they don't have particularly good sea legs, somewhere like Cumbria off the west coast, you can get a little ferry from Largs. It takes under 10 minutes and they run so frequently you don't have to worry about catching one missing the ferry. And when you get there, because it's such a small island, I think there's a 10-mile circumference road. So it's not, you know, it's maybe just a couple of miles in length, but the road around its circumference is about 10 miles. And the thing to do, the rage there is to hire bikes and cycle round the circumference, because it's not, I'll double check the circumference, but the trend there is to cycle around the circumference of the island and make a day trip of it. And that's what people do. And it's quite an achievable thing to do, even with like small children. So as long as you can ride a bike, you could probably do that. And it's just a really quirky island hop. And then you go back to the mainland for your accommodation and your evening meal.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, there's 3 things that you didn't know about your own country that I hope now are in your database. And
Yes, thank you.
108 miles for the border width. Berwick-on-Tweed as far as
Berwick-on-Tweed,
the
yeah.
change, and 790 islands to visit. You'll be going well if you get around all those to do a travel blog.
Yeah, I don't think I'll make 790, but it's amazing how many you can visit. For example, as I said, Skye is a very popular destination, but if you just catch a ferry, I think it's from Sconser on Skye, you can nip over to Rassie, which is a neighbouring island with a relatively new distillery, which has very stylish accommodation. There's also Rassie House, which does a lot of outdoor activity, so that's good for like groups or friends or families. And it's obviously a much quieter island, but you just get a very different experience. And I say that's such a short hop from Skye. It could be a day trip. You know, you go to the distillery, you have a hike, you have some lunch at Rassie House, you come back. That there's once you're on an island, you can often reach other islands. Again, like Mull is a wonderful, colourful destination with Tobermory, with the almost like paint box houses along the waterfront. But from Mull you can hop over to Iona, again a beautiful little island with a chapel that you can visit, again much smaller, so it could be a day trip or just one night, but just something a little bit different, because an island off an island is just another step further into the remoteness of it. But for the people who live there, it's just their everyday life. And there are things like co-ops and spas, it's on most of these little islands. I mean, not so much somewhere like Muck, but, even on the small islands, to the folk who live there, it's just, everyday life, going to admittedly a smaller school or a smaller co-op rather than a massive big Tesco or what have you. But it's just daily life. Whereas for us, it's all quite an adventure.
So glad you're bringing this up, because I hope that people are listening today are now seeing Scotland in a different light. It's not just about going to Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen. It's about getting out and visiting these islands, because there's so much to see, obviously, out there. And listening to Janice talk about whether you go for a day trip or whether you spend a couple of days out there, it's all very doable. Janice, what's the best time of the year, in your opinion, to visit Scotland?
I think because the weather here is so changeable, that in some senses there isn't a best time of year. Probably to get the warmer weather, I'd say between May to September, but just using common sense, maybe avoid the Easter holidays here or the school holidays. So let's say May or June, that's quite clever times to get slightly better weather. It could be bucketing down, but to get rather than actual cold weather. But you shouldn't have like lots of people on holiday. So May, June, September, they're quite good times, shoulder months, where things are still open, like the castles are all open. Whereas, in low season, a lot of things do close, often for maintenance. They've got to clean these beautiful big houses and check the tapestries and make sure the artworks and the paintings are in tip-top condition. So Christmas can be very beautiful here with markets and what have you, but I'd advise May to September, avoiding the big holidays such as the months of July and August.
That makes sense. That's very good. Now, who actually visits Scotland outside of the Welsh, the Irish and the English? Who are the number one tourist foreigners that are coming to visit Scotland?
A lot of Americans, yeah.
Has that always been the case, or is it changing recently?
Yeah, I think it's very strong links with America because of their forefathers, and they do love the royal family, and we've got strong connections there as well, and just a real draw to the place. It does seem the people who come here, it's often a holiday of a lifetime. It's a dream, or the golf. A lot of Americans like their golf as well. So, St Andrews, wonderful place to visit. It's got the castle, it's got the ruined cathedral. A lot of history there about the Reformation, quite bloody, gruesome history. Has occurred across a lot of Scotland as well. But St Andrews is a very civilised town. That's where Kate met Wills, if you remember, the university. And then it's in Fife, but there's so many little places to explore in Fife and just get a little bit off the beaten track, like fishing villages along the coast, or there's a World War II secret bunker, obviously located underground. So there's lots of little gems around. But I think the golf is a huge attraction. But out with St Andrews as well, there's some fantastic golf courses all across Scotland. It really is the home of golf. So that does draw a big American audience and a global one.
Now, if people are coming from the other side of the world to visit the UK for a holiday, how many days ideally would you recommend they plan to visit Scotland during that time?
Ideally leave a minimum of 5 days just to see the bare bones, because even if you arrive in Edinburgh, you'd probably want to have at least 2 nights there, so you have a full day. That's 2 nights of your holiday gone. You could spend up to 2 weeks here easily. It just really depends how much you need to see. We're travelling around Scotland, and we're still just on the tip of the iceberg. As you say, 790. How many? 790
islands.
Yeah. It's just how long is a piece of straw. I think like any country, like people go to America and they go to New York and they do the top. When you think about it, there's just so much to see in every country. So I went to Italy and spent 2 months there. And then I still had to go back for 3 weeks the following year. So I felt I hadn't seen Cinque Terre, I hadn't seen Pisa. There's so many places. Lucca I hadn't seen. I think it's the same in Scotland, that you can just keep exploring. And often people come and they do the their big, bucket list Scottish destinations, and then they return a few years later because they're like, well, that didn't include the East Coast, that didn't include Royal Deeside, or it didn't include Fife, Dumfries and Galloway, the borders, really getting up into the Highlands. I mean, the NC 500, that road trip, has brought more visitors to the Highlands and following that road trip. But there's still so many places to see, or I say all the island hopping you can do up to Orkney, up to Shetland, that people are returning to do more that they didn't get to see the first time. And I think, especially Scotland is quite small, but the roads are winding the more remote you go. So if you're trying to see things ping-ponging across the country, as in, from Edinburgh up to Loch Ness over to Skye, the kind of usual stomping ground, that's a lot of time just spent in the car. Whereas if you went Edinburgh up into Fife to St Andrews, up into Grampian to Deeside, then sailed up to Shetland and Orkney, you'd pack a lot more in if you looked at the geography. But I understand that some people just have one trip of a lifetime, and they're going to see the things they want to see. So it's just trying to balance it all out. But if you look at the geography, you'll probably see more if you travel in neater units, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's the best way to get around Scotland as far as transportation goes?
I would say car. I mean, you can go by the train service is good. It's not the cheapest in the world, but it is good, and that takes you to your key cities. But I'd say a lot of the places that I find more interesting, they are served by public transport, but if we're talking a rural bus service, it might be a bus an hour, and it just really ties you down, as in you're always clock watching. People are anxious about driving on the other side of the road, and I understand that. I guess it's different for us because it's not our fault we're driving on the right side of the road and everyone else is doing the wrong side. But we're used to wherever we go suddenly going, oh my gosh, the other side of the road. So it's almost, we're so used to that. But it is quite a prospect. So you can do tours as well. So let's say you want to do a little bit by train, let's say Edinburgh, Glasgow, St Andrews, Aberdeen. You could then maybe book a tour into, up to Glencoe or into Royal Deeside, so that you can train it and then get accompanied somewhere or taken somewhere, if you just are not comfortable to drive. But I think just to have all your own stuff, especially with the rise of Airbnbs, to just have food and clothing, like layers and things, it's not a place where you come with just a wee bikini and some sun cream in your bag. People often bring walking boots or wellies and different raincoats and things. So I think it's trying to travel light is a goal, and I would prefer the car if I had a choice.
Well, let's talk about the weather, because we can't get through the entire show without raising it. I don't want to be bringing doom and gloom, though, to the whole thing, but I just want to give you some more statistics here that I've been researching. Yeah. And up in the West Highlands last year, they had 3,000 millimetres of rain in the year. And down where I am now in Brisbane, we had 426 millimetres of rain in the entire year. So
parts of Scotland are wet, and it depends. Now, parts of Scotland are wetter than others for sure. I mean, there's mountain ranges, a bit like in Norway. Bergen is way wetter than Oslo because of, it traps the rain coming off the Atlantic, and then you've got the mountain range. And so I think for us, the West Coast is notably wetter than the East Coast. I mean, I'm in Aberdeen. I didn't own a brolly till I went to university in Glasgow. Never owned one. I'm not saying it doesn't rain in Aberdeen, but you tend to get bright, clear days and rain passes. You're like, oh, it's raining, then it will stop. We don't tend to get a day or several days of rain, but we do get wind, and it's colder. So if you don't like rain, maybe opt more for the East Coast. If you don't, I mean, my husband quite he grew up in Ireland, so he quite likes the kind of rain. It reminds him of home. And he was on the west of Ireland again, so I think the west coast is generally wetter than the east, and then you can just get a real mix of weather. Like, but sometimes tourists turn up, and they're disappointed if they get a lovely sunny day. They're like, I wanted to photograph a moody castle, like an atmospheric castle with mist just sitting on the water of the Loch, or like a Highland cow standing proudly in grass covered in dew, and they get a lovely sunny day, and they burn to a crisp because the wind chill maybe they don't think it's as hot as it is, and it's just not what they expected. So I think it is true that it's changeable, but obviously packing for December and packing for June, you do need, it's a difference. It is colder and warmer. We do have a summer. It's just not as clearly defined as, scorch.
Yeah.
we don't suddenly hit the scorching point.
Yeah, that's for sure. Now, when we're talking about the attractions around Scotland, and you've named quite a lot of them already during the show, I thought I'd put you on the spot and ask you to tell us, in your opinion, what's the best value for money thing to do in Scotland?
Well, it does depend what you're interested in, but obviously, like the National Trust for Scotland and Historic Scotland have kind of passes, like explorer passes or membership passes. So if you like your history, your country houses, your castles, that is a good investment to kind of buy one of them, and then almost like plan your travels around those properties. But if you're going somewhere like Orkney and Shetland, for example, that's a lot of historic Scotland because it's more kind of ruins and archaeological sites like Skara Brae, and just Jarlshof, that kind of thing. Whereas your country houses can often tend to be more National Trust. So it's also looking at where you're going and where you'll get your money's worth if you are going to invest, because there's a lot of independent castles and estates and attractions. So it's actually sussing out what you want to see.
With the advent of Airbnb around the world, what impact has that had on the beautiful boutique bed and breakfast places through Scotland that we're all so familiar with?
They're still doing really well, because I think people come here, a lot of them, as I say, it's quite a big trip for them. They want a lot of luxury and they've got money to spend on it. Or it's maybe locals treating themselves. So you've got beautiful houses with excellent food. We've got a very good larder in Scotland, from the game to the seafood, and the very fertile soil, so the vegetables, even the fruits, the berries do very well here. So you can have exceptional menus. The hotels, you can have quite big ones like the Fairmont and St Andrews that do tend to kind of offer that, or Glen Eagles, where you feel transported to another world. Like in some ways you do know you're in Scotland still, but they're very transporting experiences. And then you've got wonderful little boutique hotels like the Piques Inn, where the food is just exceptional, but it's still very informal, relaxed, quite low-key accommodation. So the focus is on having an excellent meal and good company, good wine, good whiskey, and really getting a taste of Scotland in every sense. So that the market for that has not gone away.
It's dinner time down here at the moment. You've just made me very, very hungry indeed. What's been your most memorable trip in Scotland?
I think for me, well, it's actually two, Orkney and Shetland, because it's those groups of islands have been quite exceptional, because they really entertain the children, but with grown-up sites and attractions. And we're not talking soft play or farm animals, petting zoos, that kind of thing. We could take them somewhere like Skara Brae, which is like a Neolithic settlement, and it's not too closed off to the public. You can actually walk around it and appreciate that people lived here. It's old. I think it's older than Stonehenge. I mean, it predates the pyramids, I believe. It kind of beggars belief that there's all these standing stones, and they could run off steam, but the adults take it in as well. So to have a destination where it taps into things that somehow engage and captivate others, and that's partly to do with the landscape. If you see a series of standing stones just silhouetted against a beautiful backdrop with the sea in the distance, their little jaws drop as much as ours do, and you feel they're so separate to the rest of Scotland due to that archaeology and the finds they've had there. For example, the Tomb of the Eagles, utterly fascinating, where you actually have to use a little, it's like a skateboard, and go through a tiny tunnel on your back to enter this tomb, where they used to put the skulls of the deceased. So they'd lay the body out to be picked at by birds and then just store the skulls. So a farmer came across this, must have got a bit of a shock when he found it after a storm. And that's how Skara Brae was discovered. A storm kind of started to reveal the settlement, and obviously they started digging, and it's because there was no wood up there that things weren't built so much of trees and wood, so they used stone. So obviously that's survived a lot better than, let's say, wooden settlements on the mainland. So those, and the Italian chapel, again, just a really quirky destination built by Italian POWs, where they handcrafted, like, transformed Nissen huts into a place of utter beauty for a Catholic chapel during the war. And the World War II history up there is just fascinating as well, like the sinking of the German vessels, where they sank their own Scapa Flow, they sank their own vessels, the Churchill barriers, which actually link all the islands, so you can now drive between islands because of these Churchill barriers. So if anyone's got any interest in World War II or much further back, the kind of archaeological thing, those are the islands to go for, and they do just engage you anyway. The landscape and the Shetland ponies in Shetland, I mean, there's just so much see and do that somehow entertains both young and old in a very small, you don't have to drive miles, you just nip between these destinations. It's wonderful.
Well, it's obvious to me, listening to you talking about with extreme passion your country, that whoever's listening to the podcast today and you're planning on going to Scotland, you need to put at least 2 or 3 months aside to get in there and do a lot of these things that Janice is sharing with us. Janice, I told a couple of friends that I was going to be chatting to you today, and I said, give me a couple of questions to ask Janice that are a little bit off the centre. So I've got a couple for you. Okay. The first one is, what does a typical Scottish family have for dinner?
Oh, for dinner. Well, we thought we'd have some comfort food last night, and we did go for mince and tatties.
Mince and tatties?
It was just like, basically mince with gravy and carrots and potatoes and lots of butter. But it is all about the salt and the butter, quite basic, but, potent flavours. And haggis, neeps and tatties, is such a hit in our house with the kids. I mean, we will have, we'll always have some haggis, like frozen, and just to make sure we've got it for the boys. Macaroni cheese, it's another one, which is, again, it's just like a carb fest. Butteries in Aberdeen, I'm very partial to a buttery, which someone has described as a salty croissant, and that does sound, but if you like dark chocolate with salt, imagine that. It's that kind of thing, as in who'd puts, salt in chocolate, but it's that kind of thing. It's like a salty croissant, you put some jam on it. And I remember at break time when I was at school, I'd go down to the local bakery with my pals, and I'd buy, it was either a caramel donut or it would be a buttery covered in jam, and take it back up to school. So those are some little gems.
So to all those people that I just told to go and spend 2 or 3 months in Scotland, make sure you go on a diet before you go.
But I mean, obviously this isn't the fine food like the scallops or the venison or, the cranachan with the fresh berries. I mean, this is just like home comfort food, or the Aberdeen Angus steak. I mean, there's so much quality produce and all the organic veg, so you will not, if you want to find great places to eat, a little bit of research helps, but you will not be short of excellent food.
Now look, we've rushed through our time today. I could talk to you for another hour about Scotland. There's so many things to talk about, but I did want to give you an opportunity to talk about your Facebook page called Scotland with Kids, and just let everybody know what you're doing with that.
Yeah, well, we just started that at Christmas time, just to, again, there's so many Facebook pages giving travel advice about Scotland, but it was a kind of space where people could ask questions about visiting Scotland, taking their kids, what kind of attractions there are, or just quirks as in how much itineraries that would work with a family into family-friendly cafes or hotels, but also to put people's minds at rest. If they're like, oh, well, we thought of going to this, posh hotel X, can you take kids? And it's often, yes, they've got a children's menu, or they might even have a playroom that people don't know about, or so it's just to seek advice. And a lot of the members are also people who live here, and they are experts. So there's lots of people in Edinburgh or Glasgow who can answer a question about those cities easier than I necessarily can, because they live there and they know all the little details, or information on train tickets with kids, because it's always put from an adult point of view. But I mean, anyone can kind of ask any question, really, because I always think if you're doing something with kids, then it's always going to be easier doing it without them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there you go. I'm going to put the link into that Facebook page as well. So if you're sitting out there and you want to take your kids to Scotland, you'll find that a great resource to get information. And as Janice says, if she can't answer it, there's somebody else there that can help you out. Janice, one last question before I let you go today. Whereabouts are you off to next after the travel ban's been lifted?
Well, I had to obviously cancel a trip to Loch Ness, so we hopefully return there. We're going to try a family afternoon tea at a local hotel that's Meldrum House. It's very, very lovely. So that's nice because they brought out a very specific one for little kids. We had a trip to Cape Verde cancelled in April, but I don't know if that will be resurrected at all.
Right.
I think we just probably have to skip that one for now. And then we had tickets down to London on the new sleeper train in July, and again, I don't know if that will necessarily happen. July still feels quite close, but the new sleeper's got like double beds and ensuite showers, so it's really upped its game. And I love travelling in dead time. I love falling asleep on a ferry or a train and waking up somewhere new. So
yeah, likewise. What's the travelling time for that trip down to London?
Well, it is overnight, but I think they actually pull in so that they arrive at a reasonable time. I don't think it literally takes all night, but no one wants to wake up at 5 a.m, so I think you actually sleep. Like they pull in so to make time, if that makes sense. So we boarded it at 8, I think it was 8:40 in Aberdeen, and we woke up at 7:30 to disembark.
Right.
Which when you have kids feels perfectly normal to be up at maybe 6:30, and then you're in London. You're in London at 7:30.
Yeah,
you've got
amazing.
the whole day ahead of you, and you're in the centre of London. You're not in like an airport miles away. You're right in the heart of it, and the kids just went berserk. I mean, bunk beds, 10 p.m. on a train, sleeping on a train. I mean, could it get more exciting? And the same with the ferry. So there's actually quite a lot of trips that we can potentially resurrect, and we were going to do some more exploration of Fife as well, because it's quite a rich area. We're down at this wonderful little shepherd's huts, which is a kind of glamping offering near Dunfermline. It's they're called Craig Ducky, where it's a working farm with sheep, so that's why they went for these cute as a button shepherd's huts, and you get to go and meet the lambs. And like the children could bottle feed the pet lambs. You can actually help a sheep give birth, with help obviously, if you're there at the right time. So they literally have over 1,000 lambs every April. So you're not short of lambs to cuddle or feed or learn about. So we did a little bit of Fife relatively recently, but hopefully it will return. So it's quite a long list. I mean, already quite a lot has changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's not going to be too long before we're all out travelling again. We've got to be positive about that. My guest today has been Janice Hopper. She's been talking to me about scots2travel.com. I'm going to be putting the link in the show notes for everybody to have a look at today. And Janice, thanks for giving us such a great overview on how wonderful your country, Scotland, is. And I'm sure that the tourist office is going to be run off their feet after this podcast go out there, with everybody visiting once we're allowed to travel again. So thanks very much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me.
There we are. That was wonderful Janice Hopper speaking to me from Aberdeen today on the Global Travel Channel podcast show, and a lovely transition again from her own travel experiences across the world and introducing her travel blog and what it's like to do the travel blog before telling us about all the wonderful sights and places to see across bonnie wee Scotland. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. Hope you've made a note of all the places that Janice recommended and things for you to do while you next visit the beautiful country of Scotland. Okay, well that's it for this particular episode, but if you are locked down and you're looking for more entertainment, then we've got it right here on the Global Travel Channel podcast show. All you need to do is go to the website at www.globaltravelchannel.com. There you will find over 100 episodes of amazing stories from people all across the world who have amazing travel adventure stories or destinations to talk about. And I can tell you there's many inspiring ones right there for you to go. And remember, you can download all of our podcasts from places like Apple iTunes under the podcast section. If you go to Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Castbox, there's a host of them, but they're all listed there on the website to make it easier for you. Don't forget, we've got a Patreon page as well, so check out the Patreon page and see how maybe you can get a little bit more connected to the Global Travel Channel podcast show. Well, my name's Mark Philpott, and until we meet again on the next show, I want to wish you all a very happy and safe week ahead. Bye for now.